Hello and welcome to another episode of BioTalk. I'm Chelsea Zimmerman, and with me again is Rebecca Taylor. And this episode we're going to talk about genetic engineering and the sort of split personality that we as the public in general seems to have when it comes to genetically modified foods versus genetically modifying human beings. So let's just kind of start with just very briefly, for those who don't understand what we mean by, the popular way to, the popular term that most people will see in news and stuff is GMOs, as it pertains to food and stuff, and that just means genetically modified organism. But
what is that?
Yeah. What are we doing?
A lot of proponents of genetically modified food or GMO, food based on GMO will say that it's simply just what we've always been doing, which is selective breeding, right? Mm-hmm. Ever since man has herded animals and grown crops, they've been, selectively breeding certain strains to get, the kinds of corn that we have now, and the cows and whatnot. That's not selective breeding, is not really genetic modification. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about genetically modified organisms, we're talking about organisms that have been intentionally genetically modified, usually to contain genetic material that they wouldn't normally have and wouldn't get through normal breeding programs. So, for example, a lot of crops are now Roundup ready, they call it, and that means that they've had a gene inserted that makes them resistant to herbicides like Roundup, and so they can spray fields indiscriminately, and the weeds will die, but the crops will remain. It gives greater yield. Some corn, I think, has a gene inserted that actually when bugs eat it, it's a natural pesticide, and so that kills the bugs that eats that. And cows have been cloned who are resistant to mad cow disease. These are kinds of things that we would consider genetically modified organisms. And so I think, people who want to just say that we've always been genetically modifying our crops and animals and things, it isn't necessarily true. Those are normal breeding practices. Mm-hmm. And this is something more invasive, where you're actually adding genetic material or even taking away genetic material that would normally be there.
Okay. And in the public in general, though, there's, it seems like almost every commercial I see for any sort of food product now makes it a point to say, mention that it's GMO free or it's hormone free, or, and I have lots of friends, my Facebook news feed has so many friends on it that are like, that talk about, where they get their hormone-free milk and how you can get
everything is. We're becoming a very diet-conscious society in that way. Mm-hmm. We're wanting more organic foods grown without pesticides. We're concerned about what we're eating, and that's not a bad thing. This really isn't about whether or not GMOs are good for you or bad for you. That really isn't the point of what we're talking about today. Mm-hmm. I think what we want to point out is that all of a sudden we're very hyper-vigilant about genetically modified organisms in our food supply. Mm-hmm. And, so I know of two state initiatives that were put forward on the ballot in the last couple of years. One was in California. It was Prop 37. That just barely did not pass. It was like 49% in favor, 51% not. The latest was I-522 in Washington State. These initiatives would require labeling of food that had genetically modified organisms, either in the process and so the public was very supportive. In Washington, it was 45% in favor, 55% not. And what I thought was interesting is that I live in Washington State, and so I got to see all the ads.
Yeah.
And none of the ads were focused on, none of the ads against the labeling were focused on the fact or presenting that GMO foods are perfectly safe for you. That wasn't their move. They focused on the wording of the bill initiative and the fact that it would raise food costs. And so I thought that was very telling that, they knew they weren't going to win with that, with the idea that proposing that GMO foods are perfectly safe for you and there's no really need to label.
Right.
Because I think the public wasn't going to buy it. Whether or not that's true, it isn't what we're discussing today. It's just the public perception is that GMO foods, we need to be wary of them.
I know.
And
I know.
that's the point of labeling. Yeah.
Right. I know even people who aren't necessarily opposed to. I mean, they're not on the bandwagon in terms of being totally anti-GMO or whatever, but they do still have that sort of, yeah, well, I'm not opposed to it, though I know that, it is maybe healthier to eat, organic or something like that.
Or
and
they just want to know about it.
Or
They just want to know.
They'll say something like that and say, yeah, well, I know I probably should eat that way, or that is probably healthy. There's just this mindset that even if you're not against it, you kind of should be, because that's the popular
So
opinion.
there's this movement that we're unsure. I think that's the point. We're unsure about the safety. We don't really feel like we know enough about it. We're kind of hesitant. And so an ABC poll, I think, was 69%, or it was over 50% of Americans are either think GMOs are unsafe or are unsure, and 69% thought the government should require labeling. So we're concerned about this in our food supply. We're absolutely concerned. At the same time, what baffles me is that we are actually creating genetically modified human beings in laboratories in this country, and nobody seems to care. I mean, it just seems like it's not even a blip on anyone's radar. And it's not like it hasn't gotten press. I mean, I've seen editorials in the Huffington Post, in the New York Times. It's out there, but no one seems to be, no one's writing initiatives to ban the genetically modifying human embryos. So there isn't nearly the outcry. And I'm wondering why, when we're so distrustful of genetically modified organisms in our food supply, why we wouldn't have the same distrust toward actually genetically modifying ourselves. I don't understand the disconnect there. It's quite baffling.
And I think maybe part of that is just maybe the lack of knowledge that it is actually happening. It is going on. It's just not as, I guess, well known. Maybe.
And maybe.
But when it is often supported. Because once the the people who are doing it, will explain the benefits of what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish, then it's like, oh, well, that I can see you're trying to better humanity. So that's
okay.
Right.
Yeah. But see, that's what's crazy about this is that, so for example, let's talk about some concrete examples of how scientists are genetically modifying human beings.
Right.
One of them is cloning embryos for stem cells. People don't really think of that as genetic modification because you're just kind of making a copy. But the reality is that you're actually taking DNA from the woman who donated the egg.
Right.
Okay? And that egg then contains that DNA, and then you're putting the nucleus of the person you're cloning into that egg. So what you end up with is this hybrid organism with a genetic makeup that wouldn't exist any other way, except maybe if you're cloned with your own egg, you were a woman.
And to be clear, this is being done. This is being accomplished now.
Yeah, in Oregon.
Right.
And so the idea,
we were talking about hypotheticals with that a couple years ago, but it's not
it's
anymore.
no longer hypothetical. It's absolutely a reality. And so the idea behind this is not to create, cloned human beings. The idea is to create stem cells for research and possibly for transplant, which means that you would be taking cells created with the very same cloning technique that makes cloned cows. And using it as a treatment for a patient, which means injecting that patient somehow with the stem cells that come out of that. So while we are wary of drinking milk and eating, meat from a cloned cow, the very same people might, be totally supportive of cloning embryos for stem cells.
And they very much are. And we saw that very definitively in Missouri in 2006. And that's what that campaign was all about. It was all about cloning for stem cell research. And while it didn't pass by the overwhelming majority that many hoped it would, it still passed. And the people supported it wholeheartedly and and passionately for the way this would help treat human beings and lead to cures and
yeah. So on one hand, we're suspicious of genetically modified, cloned meat,
cows,
cloned milk, any production of clone, or even offspring of cloned cows. Like we're even going down that road. I've seen, where there's concern about that, and yet we seem to have no problem with the idea of injecting ourselves with stem cells from a dead clone. Our dead clone, actually. And so that seems very unusual. And the other case is this, the case of the 3-parent embryo,
which we did a whole episode on that a couple episodes back, and that's actually been in the news lately as the United States, the FDA has been looking at
that. And and they weren't really even concerned about the ethics of it. They just were just worried about the practicalities. Well, so the 3-parent embryo would create an embryo with genetic material from 3 people. So you'd have the mitochondrial DNA from the woman who donated an egg, and then the nuclear DNA, this chromosomes from a mother and a father. And what they would do is they genetically modify the egg to have, they would remove the nucleus from a donor, put in the nucleus of the woman with the mitochondrial disease. Then you end up with this hybrid egg, with genetic material from 2 women, and then you would just allow normal fertilization with sperm. And they've created these embryos in Oregon and in the UK. And so that is actually the absolute definition of genetic modification, because there's just no way that those children would come out that way naturally. And the problem with this is it doesn't just modify that one embryo. This is now a germline modification, which means that this embryo created with this technique could not help but pass that modification on. Okay, especially if they're girls, because the mitochondria you get from your mother. So we're looking at a major modification of one generation and then every generation after. Right. So, this is a big deal. And, and this is all in the name of curing disease, in the name of improving human health. Right. So and yet when, there were calls for, input from the public through the FDA, one case in point was the Center for Genetics and Society, their leftist progressive organization, who wrote a letter, really outlining all of the risks and the fact that this is untried, even in primates, really. We really don't have a lot of information about this, even in primates. Studies, no generational studies, no. In fact, animal studies are telling us that this is actually, very dubious, because there is a problem with a mitochondrial nuclear DNA mismatch and things like that. So the science is telling us not to move forward, is what what they were saying. It was a really great letter, and only they sent back and said only 255 people signed it. And I was just, and this is a leftist group, a progressive group, so you would think in that group that you would have more support.
Right.
for that. You would expect that from a more conservative standpoint, but this, I thought, because of the idea that progressives might be more environmentalists and more concerned with the environment and genetically modified organisms, you'd think that they would be kind of on top of this, and they're not. So I just don't understand the disconnect there. And somebody wrote a comment that, well, everyone has to eat food, but not everybody has to have a genetically modified kid.
Right.
Right, and that may be the reason, but the reality is that anybody who's ever thought about this realizes that once we go down this road, once we start modifying our children and modifying them to the point where every generation after is modified, it will only be a matter of time before we do this in the nucleus, right? So we're going to start doing this with nuclear DNA. There's a new protein found in bacteria that really can splice DNA in with ease, they're finding, for all different organisms. And so we're going to start, intervening on the nuclear genome. And then once that happens, basically it's going to be what environmentalist Bill McKibben calls the biological arms race, where everyone is kind of forced into modifying their children because everyone else is doing it. So this really isn't just going to affect those people with mitochondrial disease. The reality is once we start down this road.
Well, yeah, there've already been op-eds and opinion pieces from some intellectuals and some people in the saying that let's say genetic modification does become commonplace for certain diseases or whatever. Then what happens when we start identifying genes for, creating, what was this one was specifically about like creating nicer people,
Right. Yes.
And
we're morally obliged to do
yes.
that.
That was the topic of the paper was, we will have a moral obligation to modify our offspring to be the best.
Yes, to improve and to be the best people. And so that's what people don't realize, that this will start out as a choice, as maybe a quote a nice option for parents. It will become obligatory. There's just no way around that. We will become a society where we have a moral obligation to create perfect children.
It will be pressure. It will be done through pressure, just like like the way we are kind of doing an ethnic cleansing in the womb through
search and destroy mission for anybody genetically quote defective,
right? And so and that's like we've talked about before. There's parents are bullied into making these decisions, and that's what we're talking about here. That's where this is going to lead once we start.
Right, it'll be Gattaca. Like everyone thinks it's a science fiction film, but you will be a second-class citizen if you don't have a certain modification or whatever. And what is particularly disturbing is that parents, think, okay, well, I can do to my kids what I want because I'm the parent, and I have that right as a parent because they're my children. But do you have the right to do that to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and your great-great-grandchildren and so on and so on and so on? These are choices that you're making for generations. And that is why, 40-plus countries have outlawed or have laws, about inheritable genetic modifications like the ones, like the three-parent embryo, because you realize that this is one decision that one generation makes that will affect every generation after. It's just not, it's really not a line we want to cross, right? And we don't, and so I just, so if we're just uneasy about genetically modified food, it should really be unthinkable to consider genetically modifying offspring, even if it is for, perceived good, right? We should be bringing that same skepticism that we have toward modifying nature. And because we are a part of nature in that
So
sense.
where do you see, I mean, we like you said, we do have 41 countries or whatever who, now right now we're just talking about the genetic modification of like the germline modification and stuff that the 41 countries or whatever have bans on, but the UK is decided to
considering
go for.
lifting theirs. They have one, but
Mm-hmm.
they're considering lifting or making an exception.
Mm-hmm.
They at least have one.
Okay, yeah.
So they would have to make an exception for the 3-parent embryo, and then they would probably have to make another exception for any kind of nuclear DNA, modification scenario.
And then you've got the United States with the FDA. They didn't really make any judgment call on it one way or the other, though. There was no decision was made after, what was it, 2 weeks ago they had these meetings?
Yeah, 2 days of.
And then when we were going back to the whole cloning thing we were talking about before, just for stem cell research and stuff, we've talked about that too in previous
and the
episodes.
FDA is the one that's going to regulate all of that, whether or not you can take stem cells from a cloned embryo and whether that's safe to inject into a patient or whatnot. But we just don't have, the FDA is not the law. Right. And so, and the
we
person
don't
up there
have
teaches,
and there's no real indication that we're going to have any laws regulating this stuff in the near future. We're doing all kinds of things for regulating the food industry, regulating genetic modification, whether it's just labeling, whether it's just public awareness, for what about genetic modification in our food system and our food supply. There's a national effort, if you will, to at least raise awareness about it and regulate it and do things in the government about it. With human beings, we have none of that right now, and
there's no push for any of that. Yeah,
even just awareness raising, like you said, like with the whole petition thing that's only getting about 200. It's just not. It's
crickets. Is what you start talking about this, and it's crickets.
Yeah,
they come back at you, and you're like,
we don't. We need to start talking about something a little bit more uplifting.
I know. I think those of us who really understand, like the Center for Genetics and Society, understands the implications of what's going on here. Mm-hmm. This really is a critical moment in human history. Are we going to allow the intentional genetic modification of future generations? Is this the route we're going to take? If we say yes to that question, I really don't know where it will end.
Right.
Really. And that it really is that important. I think personally, it is the issue of our generation. Mm-hmm. Yet we're still contemplating our navels and talking about whether or not a fetus is a human being.
Right.
So we're stuck on pro-life 1.0 issue, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. When pro-life 3.0 is staring us in the face and we're ignoring it. And that's really disturbing. Mm-hmm. To me, I understand abortion is absolutely important. It is one of the greatest issues of our time. But we have a chance right now. If you had the chance to go back and decide and to really influence Roe v. Wade,
right?
Would you not do it? Well,
that's where we're at right now. Well, hopefully we'll have something more positive to talk about next time. I don't know. We'll try to come up with something better. I don't know. But,
something.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much.